Actually, we have altogether 4 panelists, but today, Mia, Mai, okay, sorry, Siti, Mai from the fellow from Indonesia. She's not physically here, but she recorded her presentation and she's really on Skype for Q&A later on. And I would like to introduce briefly about the panelists. And we have altogether 4, including myself as a moderator. I'm acting as moderator as well as panelist and presenting my paper as well. So Sarah is on my left hand. She's a research fellow at Stockholm Environment Institute, Asia Center. Within Gender, Environment and Development Cluster, Sarah conducted her PhD with the Political Ecology Research Group at the International Institute of Social Studies, ISS. And at the Hugo Observatory, University of Lille, Belgium, she has lectured at Saint Paul, Paris 13 Sorbonne, at the Brussels School of Journalism and Communication, and has worked as a research fellow and associate for several universities, think tanks, and international organizations. And Babette, she's well-known feminist. Wow. Babette is selection senior research fellow at Stockholm Environment Institute. A lot of books published by her and her fellows and her colleagues. Yeah, on gender and water and climate change. Yeah, that's it. It's very good for gender for Babette. And myself, a lecturer based at Ubon Ratchathani University in the Northeast region of Thailand. I've been working on water governance issues and lately on genders and land issues that I'm going to present today. Okay, since we here don't have, I don't think you have any coffee. But we don't have any coffee. Hopefully, is cooking. Sorry, Sarah is not your presenter, not yet right. Okay, I would like to introduce Sarah. To start first, she's going to talk about towards feminism, geographical ecology, and land grabbing and migration. Sarah, the floor is yours.
So hello, good morning everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to present a bit of my research at this very interesting conference. And today I'll be speaking, departing from my PhD research, which has dealt with the complex interactions between environmental change, land grabs and migration, and departing from that research, why and how is it important to bridge critical feminist theories with political ecology at various scales. So just to give a brief overview of how this presentation will go, I will first of all introduce the research context and the background, what has led me to this research and why I thought it was important to do it, the research question and the analytical framework that this work, and research is actually being comparative between Senegal and Cambodia. Given this conference, I will mostly give examples from Cambodia, while always underlining that actually a lot of my findings were possible thanks to the comparison and not just as a result of looking into one particular country. And then at the end, I'd like to open up towards the discussion about the importance of moving this work towards feminist geopolitical ecology. So, first of all, my research is situated between two broadly defined fields, two broadly and well-established pieces of work, which are the literature that deals with the connections between environmental change and migration, otherwise known as environmental migration. A lot of you might have already heard, of course, of this phenomenon, and how is it that human dynamics in the context of climate change are modified or exacerbated or are changed due to anthropogenic climate change. And of course, people have moved because of environmental changes for a long time, but what is different today is that climate change is humanly created, and thus that brings a lot of questions of social justice and responsibility into the equation. So I've been working on the interlinkages of environmental change and migration for many years. And through my research, I came to realize, of course, that although the advancement in the understanding in the field has been important, showing the complexities between these interactions, there were certain things that were missing. So, for example, not only what are the biophysical impacts of environmental change, but how do climate politics and environmental discourses shape the very realities of migration, mostly by modifying access to natural resources. And here is where we go to the phenomenon of land and green grabs, which most of you will, of course, be familiar with since the 2006-2007 triple crisis, financial, food, environmental. There's a rush to control land that is unprecedented in scale since the colonial era. In the context of climate change, a lot of these land grabs and appropriations of natural resources are done for environmental ends. So green grabs defined by Fairhead and colleagues as the appropriation of nature for environmental ends. So this is also not new. This is a dynamic that has occurred ever since colonialism. But today, climate mitigation, climate adaptation discourses have given this phenomenon a new dimension. So, parting from these, my main research question was why and how do environmental change, migration, and land grabs shape each other, both materially and discursively, and with what consequences? So, as you see, a broad question that deals not only with the material interactions between these phenomena, but importantly, how the very frames around these phenomena shape the realities under study. So just a very quick word about the importance of frames, and we know that how we frame the interactions between certain phenomena determines the kind of questions we ask, determines the kind of knowledge that is produced, and as a result determines the kind of interventions that we put forward. So broadly speaking, there are two main ways, there have been in the mainstream policy debates, two main ways of explaining the interactions between these phenomena, whether it be neo-Malthusian security frames, which locate the root of the problem in population growth, or whether it be more neoclassical adaptation frames, which locate the root of the problem more in a lack of innovation, a lack of technology, and a lack of appropriate distribution of factors of production. So what I do in my dissertation is I critique these frames from a very dated geopolitical ecology framework, which is the result of the confluence of various streams of theory, whether it be world systems, mostly world ecology by Jason Moore, political geography, critical geopolitics, of course in the broadly defined field of political ecology, and taken into account variegation, which means that we can't assume that these phenomena are going to play out evenly across the world. We know that the capitalist core has not expanded equally around the world. So what is it? What is it that explains differences, and how can these differences be understood? So to do so, I did a global ethnography and an incorporated comparison, which basically locates the root of these phenomena in colonialism. I do a geopolitical ecology as if migration and nature mattered in both Senegal and Cambodia, but then I follow through and see how the different political transitions that these countries have had shape the very realities of the interactions under study. So there's a historical comparison, there's a country comparison at the national scale. Why does it matter where these countries are located in different regional political economies? And then I zoom down into three different landscapes where land grabs are occurring. to try to understand how these things happen at the micro scale. So in doing so, I take a circular approach which goes really from the global to the local and vice versa. And how do these very specific landscapes, what do they tell us about the broader geopolitical, ecological contexts in which they unfold? And because I don't have time here to go into all the details, the nitty-gritty details of the research, just a very brief overview of the current moment in Cambodia with regards to land grabs. I'm sure that many people here have worked in the region, and this is a very famous map to see the scale of economic land concessions. And of course, at the turn of the century, there's the differences that environmental change and migration discourses take, understandably so, a very important role in policy discourses internationally, which means also that they are used and deployed in different ways to justify certain interventions. The two main crops in Cambodia are rubber and sugar. Rubber within economic land concessions. Rubber has been flexed hypothetically, really, at the national level by trying to say, well, rubber is also a tree. By using rubber, we can maybe be able to apply to REDD+, carbon offsetting mechanisms, etc. This is not actually a reality at the policy scale, because rubber is not considered forest cover for the UNFCCC, although yes, for the FIO. But that's not precisely the question in Cambodia at the national level. This very idea that by expanding rubber we might also be able to tap into climate finance mechanisms has been used to justify in a certain way the expansion of this crop, so greening rubber. And sugar has risen exponentially also as a result of markets for biofuels internationally. So sugar is part of the global sugarcane complex, which is also linked to climate discourses. At the same time that these economic land concessions take place, there's also a lot of protected areas in Cambodia, and there's also a lot of policies to try to protect the forest resources in a country that coming out of such a turbulent history had quite a bit of forest at the turn of the century. However, unfortunately, a lot of these protected areas have been used as forest concessions in disguise, and the rate of deforestation in Cambodia is amongst one of the highest in the world. But if we look at the national scale in Cambodia, something that's important, how have these discourses been used? And this is radically in opposition to what happens in Senegal. I will just hint to that to give a bit of context. So one of the things that we have to understand that immigration, international migration in Cambodia during the war period, etc., was very limited. But then it started flowing, and the countries, Thailand, Malaysia especially, still need a large amount of cheap labor and of low-skilled labor. So migration from many countries is seen as an escape valve out of poverty, as a way to adapt to the situation so that migrants can send remittances back home, etc. And this was also true in Senegal until the financial crisis, where international migration becomes criminalized. And thus, a lot of interventions in land are done in the name of trying to stop migration. So there will be some kind of employment creation, and migration will stop. Here, it's not exactly the case. Here, it's more, in Cambodia, it's about criminalizing internal migration. These laws, in practice, that's what they do, because internal mobility in Cambodia is very important, especially to access land. There's a huge amount of landlessness amongst the most vulnerable. But together with environmental discourses, internal migrants have become criminalized. For example, illegal logging, as a government official says, illegal logging and forest destruction happens because of migrants. It is illegal. But they still want to cut the forest and move there. We can't let them. We must protect the environment. Or another, they migrate because they are greedy. people already had enough land. They never have enough. They are criminals. They come and they say they want land. They are criminals. How can they do that? We say illegal, not criminals. If they do harm to the environment, then it becomes criminal. And then they should go, they should go. They have nothing to do here. We need people that can invest here, not just some poor farmers that do nothing. We should go. So here we see a bit how environmental security discourses are linked with this long historical fear that it's migration that creates destruction. However, without really making a distinction between the migrants that do create environmental harm and small-scale farmers that, while they do create a certain amount of deforestation, when we put it into context, it's really minimal, the amount. So corporations are not dubbed as migrants, landless farmers are, however. And I'm not sure, yeah, okay. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go now into the details of the case studies, but just to say that the various land grabs happen in confluence with one another. So, for example, in Hong Kong, there's a sugar plantation, but the people have been displaced before by conservation, or what has been dubbed as fortress conservation by Brockington earlier. So it's a confluence of conservation and extraction that really leads to this. And there's also discourses such as we are concerned with the elephants, not with human rights. So in the name of the environment, certain violent environments occur. And of course, also in Kampong Tom here, we see a confluence of different overlapping land grabs that lead to different types of migration. So to say here that they are flex grabs in the sense that green migration grabs tend to happen in tandem. They've occurred since colonialism to determine who can access what and for what purposes. And they often also determine labor flows into plantations. So it's not just about controlling nature, it's also about controlling labor. However, they can be justified by very different reasons at different scales, by different motives. And whether migration or environmental justifications prevails depends on the migration system of certain countries. So as I've said in Cambodia, migration justifications are not very strong. It is much more environmental ones. This is not the case in Senegal, and we can only explain this by looking at the broader regional migration system. In all cases, they have created self-fulfilling risks, which really comes from the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, which is really the wrong definition of a phenomenon actually can lead to interventions that, by believing that that phenomenon is real, they turn out to make it real. So they make, in the end, migration maladaptive, they make, in the end, migration a security threat, etc. They range, they have very different impacts, from expulsion to adverse incorporation to distress out migration. In many cases, as Tanya Lee has already showed, the land is needed, but the labor is not. So this idea that large-scale plantations will provide labor in situ for people that will then be able to stay in place and not migrate doesn't materialize on the ground. And actually, access to land is the first and the most important factor that determines whether migration is adaptive or maladaptive in the subsequent phases. So just to end here, in all of these, when we look at the impacts of these land grabs, women are often very differently affected to men. In the case of Cambodia, actually, and very differently to Senegal, there's a lot of responsibility on women to out-migrate when these land grabs happen, whether it be to Phnom Penh, to the garment sector, or to work as domestic workers in Malaysia, etc. So they have, it's not an adaptive strategy, but it's an added responsibility layer that is added onto women because actually the labor market demands a certain type of employment. But without going into the specifics, it's here important, I think, to also look at the gender dimensions as global processes and not just as a result of them. So not just looking at how these land grabs are going to impact gender inequalities differently, but also how gender inequality is a fundamental structural driver of land grabs to start with. So this is something that I'd like to explore in my work. So not only how green grabs and migration grabs shape landscape, shape environmental change, shape migration, but is there such a thing as pink grabs? So are there being appropriations of nature and of natural resources for gender equality aims? And what are these consequences? So today we know that in the green economy, green jobs, etc., a lot of these are meant to be about empowering women. And that is fine in practice, but I think we need to look at whether they actually do, whether they don't, and what are the self-fulfilling risks of these discourses. So to understand their controversies and their incongruencies, to be able to suggest a path forward. And also, are there gender dimensions to security and adaptation frames? So environmental security, environmental adaptation. What are the gendered underpinnings of these discourses, and how do they influence discourse and practice? So these are very mainstream environmental policy discourse. Are they gendered? With what consequences? And in that sense, bringing that in, and then looking at the results, and more in terms of labor, of gender equality, etc. But not only this at a very national level, but also looking at broader geopolitical ecologies. So by that I mean, are certain gender equality discourses, what are the possibilities that they actually lead to real transformative change in certain political contexts in comparison to others? So will they happen differently if the donors are European, if the donors are Asian? Who dictates how these discourses are implemented and who shapes them? And how in turn do these shape broader geopolitical ecologies? And this is a part that I will be exploring as I move forward. So thank you very much, and with that I will finish.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And we collect questions later on after the finish their presentation. Next, I would like to actually, she's not physically here, as I said, mine. Before we present her recorded tape, I would like to introduce her a little bit. She's a scholar activist from Indonesia. She is studying feminist political ecology. She's a PhD student at the University of Passau, Germany, and a fellow of Maria Sklodowska Curie, WECO-ITM. Oh, okay. She's working on issues around mining, gender, and indigenous people in Indonesia by combining research, popular writing, and environmental justice activism. She is preparing her first writing collaboration on research ethics and the colonial thinking, and looking forward to practicing in her research about how ethnicity, gender, and intersectionality shape the research frontier in Indonesia. So, okay, that is going to turn on her presentation.
Everyone, good evening. My name is Anna. First, I would like to thank to organizer that allow me to present, even I cannot attend this important panel. My presentation is about beyond recognition of adult forests, feminist political ecology, and research frontier on customary forests in Indonesia. I will start with outline my presentation. First, introduction, my background and why it's important context for Indonesia at the moment. And the second is research question. Third is conceptual tools. I will use that to explaining reclaiming the frontier and customary forest recognition. And then I will close with the thinking through decoloniality and intersectionality. First, introduction, my background. I'm studying feminist political ecology as conceptual tools, part of the network called WECO, Wellbeing, Ecology, Gender, and Community with Big O. My background also an environment activist who was working with the national network NGOs in Indonesia, I will use my experience work with the National Human Rights Commission in Indonesia in 2015-2016 as a facilitator for inquiry on indigenous people over forest customary right. And then this is also part of my research proposal on ethnicity, gender, and intersectionality in the resources frontier in Central Kalimantan, Indonesia. This topic is important because first is the changing of global political economy and concern to indigenous people, extractive project, and climate crisis. And it's related with Indonesian as the second biggest exporter of thermal coal because of changing of the state power dynamic from national in the context of centralization government to decentralization in 1999 and opening space for indigenous people to contesting the customary right, contesting the power by reclaiming the customary forest. And to what extent this provides space to challenge extractive regime and bring out interests of minority groups and another difference and protect nature, it needs to interrogate. I use the feminist political ecology as the conceptual tools to interrogate. The second is a research question. First is how resource frontiers shape customary or adat. So adat is customary right in Indonesian context. Forest recognition in Indonesia, and then second is how does indigenous group reclaim adat forest in the dynamic of extractive regime? And third, thinking through the colonial and intersectionality, how the adat forest reclaim is a challenge of extractive regime. So I use the conceptual tools of first is frontier, second is extractive regime, and third is the coloniality and intersectionality. Frontier first is introduced by Frederick Turner to describe about the situation in colonial America as wilderness, primitive and uncivilized, which is similar the way how the colonial Europe see Indonesia in the past. And then the concept of frontier expands by Anna Singh, for example, that mentioned, but frontier is space and time, imaginary and reality of the zone that not yet mapping or unplanned with the expectation of development to come. And resource frontier grow up when entrepreneurs and armies are able to disengage nature from its previous ecologies to satisfy the global market. A frontier is not a space itself, it's something that happens in and to the space. I use the extractive regime to contextualize this making and remaking a resource frontier in Indonesia that created by Paul Kageler, and then to see the difference of the situations, I use the colonial critics and intersectionality, which is looking the present world system as a historical structural heterogeneous totality as a colonial port matrix. So the situation is kind of we just passed the colonial, but actually we're still in the colonial situation without colonial administration. And then in the coloniality power, there is entanglement power, which is intersection. It's not just gender, but also others power relate, like religion, race, class, and so on. Okay, when we talk about the frontier, we talk about the time and space. So I draw how the making of the frontier in Indonesia in the context of colonial space and time, and also post-colonial. It always there is transition between different regime. So it starts when the global demands for spices and agricultural products become the stimulus for the colonial frontier. What happened in the frontier, in the colonial frontier, is when the colonial Dutch is claim all the land and forests that not broken, as a private owner is become the state owner. Then it's open space for various of concession, logging, oil, coal, and so on. And after independence, it's continuing. The Indonesian government adopts the colonial regulation under the formation of the nation state. The frontiers are reconfiguring during increasing of a global demand for food and natural resources. Is a stimulus for resource frontier rise and territorialization remain. And what happened in the frontier is I try to compare what the Indonesian situation in the post-colonial during centralization to decentralization, how the regulation creates to open the space for concession and change during the centralization to expand the concession to other place, others commodities, because one commodities is declined and the market adds to new commodities, for example, oil palm plantation and coal. And the regime of extraction also changed, more facilitating foreign business during centralization, and then during centralization, there is also call for resource nationalism, and it's also changing the situation and geography, because one of commodities in one place and another other place is not have the same commodities, and also it's more rise on the demand of accountability of the government during decentralization, which is give space for the indigenous people, approximately 40 million hectares of Indonesian state forest land should be under customary control. It's recognized by constitution, but it's not in the practice. So during decentralization, the indigenous people use how to contesting the power used to the accountability demand of other governments. Just give the example of what happened in the indigenous people land. This is the example of the Punandulau community. Just see to the bottom of the posters. Sorry, it's still Indonesian. In the past, in around 70 during New Order regime, Dayak Punan moved by the government to other place, and then their area become logging concession, and now they have difficulties because still until now they still difficulties to live because the area is extremely shrinking. From thousands of hectares become just 1.7 hectares, and the population also increasing. And then, but what the relation frontier and remaking frontier with Indonesian situation, I mean the state power. You can see this is the Borneo Island, how it's changing commodity extraction time by time, one declining and change to others. That Gellert call is the extractive regime, the combination of developmental and predatory practice which rely on the multiple extractive commodities, which is changed when one of them decline. For example, during decentralization is changed by coal and oil palm. The situation is actually the way how the ensuring the capital against collapse. But the centralization is often the space for the indigenous people to contesting the power. In 1999, the Organization of Indigenous People established. There is the famous quote: "If state do not recognize us, will not recognize the state." And then in 2012, they filed suit to the Constitutional Court to reviewing the Forest Act 99, number 41, that state all the custom forest is under state forest. And they want, in 2013, the state should recognize indigenous people right and also their territory. And it's become the important program under the Jokowi regime for first fase and then continue in the second fase. There is various of effort that indigenous people doing and engage in contesting. Some of it they do like plantissasi. This is plantissasi of customary forests, and then also participation mapping. That's why they can claim how big size of the customary forest, and then they also collaborate with the Human Rights National Commission to inquiry of the case to get what actually the case and the conflicts and how it's solved. And by that, they can identify that around 38% from 9.8 million hectare forest of customary forest is overlapped with the extractive project. My last point is number 5, thinking through the coloniality and intersectionality. I will use this picture. Imagining this picture is my previous explanation about Indonesian situation. I always interesting. This picture always interesting for me. There is the conservation area of land with indigenous people area. Indigenous people area of land with the plantation, concession, mining, and indigenous people defend their land, their right with animal. But this picture is not complete. The colonial critics and feminist critics challenge the way how we see this picture in the context of in the colonial power matrix. So the coloniality situation, that's colonial situation without colonial administration, which is there is entanglement power, intersectionality in this kind of situation is not just man face to face with the state, but there is intersectionality issue within society, power relation, the dynamic power relation within society, and how the relation with the environmental changing in Indonesian context. So this why I use the feminist political ecology to see differently Indonesian context, use the decoloniality and intersectionality to interrogate and understanding Indonesian situation. Because the coloniality of power is challenge the way how to understand the state power dynamics and intersection hierarchies within communities that shape the making and the making of resource frontier in Indonesia. So it's become my research, PhD research, to document the way in what how the state policies and resource control and extraction.
Okay, that's it. That's her presentation, and then we wait until we have Q&A. Okay, David, can you say something?
Yes. Yes, good morning. My name is Babette Resurrection, as my colleague, Dr. Kanapuan, has earlier introduced me. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce her. Associate Professor Kanapuan Manorom is Director of Mekong Subregion Social Research Center, or MSSRC, based at the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Ubon Ratchathani University here in Thailand. She earned her PhD in Rural Sociology from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and she was granted the Australian Leadership Award fairly recently as a visiting scholar at the University of Sydney in 2011. She has been working in Thailand and in the Mekong region as a whole in fields such as political economy and resource governance, livelihood analysis, development and impact assessments as well. She's closely worked with civil society organizations and has a long history of engagement with hydropower issues since I've known her. She worked on the Mekong Fellowship Project under the Mekong Program on Water Empowerment and Resilience, and Water, Land and Ecosystem Program in the Greater Mekong from 2012 to 2017. So she's currently a steering committee member of the SummerNet program of SEI, and since 2014 she has been collaborating with researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and University of Alberta on the importance of local and indigenous knowledge on sustainable resource governance, very much aligned with what Mai had earlier presented on Indonesia. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Achang Kanapuan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Babette. I have 15 minutes for presenting my paper. I've been working with local women in Mukdahan Special Economic Zones over the past 2 years, so I just finished my research. And my focus today is on the role of states as land broker states in the special economic zone, and how the women been affected by the special economic zones, and how the states play a role in the area, and how the local people respond to that. Yeah, I got to 4 points. Start with my framing, and then state as land workers, and also the struggle of females and narratives of the female in the area, their voices and their struggle, and then conclusions about feminist political economy within the land worker states atmosphere. Okay, as the previous presenter might talk about frontier capitalism, also I employ the concept of frontier capitalism because the special economic zone in Thailand always located along the Thai borders, sharing with Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. But in terms of frontier capitalism in my study, so it's about local authority bypass central government to support private sector to exploit frontier resource. It's quite different angles from the previous presenter, and create these possessions of land from the local people and turning resource periphery into resource revenue. And the second concept is about feminist political ecology, as you said, it's about political ecological life, about access and control over resource and knowledge about natural resources. And we try to analyze the identities of the women in the area within the context of resource degradation and how genders being shaped and linked to the question of struggle, environment change, and degradation. And what does it mean by land broker states? I borrowed the concept from Levin. He studied land issues in special economic zone in India. This paper is very well known and very popular among people who study special economic zone in Asia and around the world because he employed political economy in the analysis. And he found that land being taken from the present and a lot of violence over there, and women got raped and people got killed, and the government just played a role as a broker to get land from the local people for the capitalists. And what does it mean by frontier capitalism in Isan region? Isan has been the northeast region of Thailand. So Isan region has been considered by the Thai state as the poor, underdeveloped, and it, of course, sharing the border with Cambodia has become a security issue as well. And that's why the government regards this area as a backward, and we need to develop, we need to take advantage of this area and allow the local people over there in the northeast region to benefit from the border trade. And land, river, and water become commoditized and transformed into the commodities within the context of regional economic integration. Of course, the border trade between Laos and Thailand has been increasingly over the past 10 years. This stimulated the government to invest more on the border development. And what does it mean by the government as brand resource broker? So, as you know, in Thailand over the past 6 years, the NCPO played a great role under the military regime. So because of the NCPO, the National Council for Peace and Order, this is the first time in Thailand that special economic zone has been approved by the government. Before that, like 10 years ago, Thaksin government during the democratic system, the Thaksin government tried to propose this idea but rejected totally by the civil society and academics, because you cannot turn the land into the local land or any land in any place in Thailand to the capitalist, because you're going to sell land to foreigner. This is you have to sell your country. This is the opposed seriously by the local people, civil society. But under the military regime, nothing happened. The government just announced no one protests because of the martial law. No one spoke about that, even they spoke quietly, because otherwise you would be arrested. So they allow local the business to take advantage. So having a lot of rules and regulations to allow the private sector, for example, you could have income tax exemption, you could rent the land for at least 50 years with low pay of the payment, the interest, and allow you to use foreign unskilled laborers. So these kind of things allow the private sector to benefit the special economic zone announced throughout Thailand. And in the area where I study, in Mukdahan province, Mukdahan is just near the Savanakhet special economic zone, or Sawanseno special economic zone. Laos established special economic zone long before Thailand. So a lot of things going on there, those is kind of taking advantage. So the Lao government got more advantage, they have low level of labor force, they pay less money to labor. So compared to Thailand, Thailand has to pay a lot more money on the labor. So the incentive for the private sector is not interested in Thailand, but they're interested in Laos side. But the government tries to promote this, even though they have to compete. And based on the study of ADB said the special economic zone promoted in the Mekong rather having cooperation, but they are competing each other. This is the ADB report. So Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam have a lot of special economic zone, but they're competing each other. They try to attract a lot of investors into the country. And Thailand is going to compete there, I don't know, it's a big question. In Mukdahan, the government tried to build Mukdahan as a trading and multimodal transportation centers and industrial zone, and try to build twin track railway from Khon Kaen, Mukdahan, Nakhon Phanom, within the region, and try to build the highway. This is the infrastructure development being provided in the area. We just get started. And for the local people in that area, in this area, in Mukdahan, the land used to be the common property, the common land for everyone. And they use land for like grazing areas and lands for like local livelihoods. But the government claimed that this land with the common areas, all common area in Thailand by law belong to the government. So the government can take any land. It's considered as common land. So even if no one, it's not private land. This is from the government paper. So you see, in the area, people use part of the common land that assigned to be the special economic zone for rice farming, for fishing, for grazing, and for aquatic animals, for her personal things. So it's like life. It's life for people over there, particularly women, because women as it's household food providers, so they just go and get food from the land. So as I said, you see that it's a non-NTMP products they could get from the land that now consolidated and assigned as special economic zone. So they suffer because the loss of land related to resources. Actually, these lands used to be one of the most important land for cattle raising area in the northeast region of Thailand. They raise a lot of cattle, they could make a lot of money using this land, but this land now turned to special economic zone because they said this is a common land, it's not private land. We can turn the land to the government land easily at any time. So women, they suffer because there's a cattle considered as like big income for them. It's saving income for them. When we have any problem in the community household, they can sell cattle. They sell cattle for their children education. They sell cattle for any like building house or go to the hospital when they have problem or when their children get married. They just have the money from selling those kind of cattle. So they exclude from negotiation because most common land and private land used by women have been expropriated in order to build highway, as I said, and two-track trains. And the government, the state and village leader, they cooperate together with local government. And no chance for the people over there to negotiate with the NCPO. And of course, even they got land from the government, like 30 years ago, the private land, the religious land granted by the government called Sopoko is like reformative land. So the government said, if you have Sopoko land, it's still our land, the government land. We can take the land back from you at any time. So they tried to negotiate to get a better compensation from the government. The government said, okay, since you have Sopoko land title deed, still government, this is form of government title deed. The money or the compensation it would be given very low, something about maybe $1,000 per right. Actually, the market price a lot higher than that. It's more than 100,000 baht per right, but they would get only 30,000 baht per right. This is not fair for them, but very difficult for them because no NGO over there, no civil society over there to help them. They just try to struggle by themselves to negotiate with the government. So in my conclusion, special economic zone is acting as a representation of frontier capitalism. It's cooperated by the central government, the local government, the line agencies, in order to favor the land and give the land to the capitalists or the private sector. And the state, instead of support the local government, local people, that they become a land resource broker. They appropriate land from local people. They allow local business sector to get cheaper land from local people. And this affects women's everyday life. They create suffering because they feel it's so uncertain future. Because they don't know what to do if they lose land. So how the children are going to survive? Because they depend on lands a lot. They grow a lot of cash crops in order to survive. And women excluded from the benefit of development in the so-called special economic zone. And also related to feminist political equality, I think gender inequalities are linked to struggle, environmental change, and degradation, and the centrality of enclosure to transition to frontier capitalist industry. Thank you very much, Babette. And now my turn to introduce Babette. Babette is going to be the last speaker. She's going to talk quite different from the first three presenters. The first three presenters focus on rural society, rural women, the struggle of people over there at the local scale and up to the national scale. But Babette turned to another interesting, is very critical presentations on gender professional in environment and development, theory and praxis, thoughts, feminist political ecology. Babette's the floor is yours.
Thank you, Achan. As Achan Kanawan mentioned, I will depart a little bit from the three discussions earlier on rural landscapes. I will look at the flip side of feminist political ecology and looking more at the practices of professionals and how they attempt and aim to change these landscapes, how they understand these landscapes. So we're looking now at the people who are actually professionalizing the sector, for that matter, from a feminist political ecology lens. So I think as many of you in the room know, feminist political ecology, it's a very loose platform of scholars and activists who actually emphasize gender dimensions of power and politics at different scales, around issues of environmental degradation, the appropriation of nature, its neoliberalization, and of course the struggles over knowledge, power, and practice, as so clearly demonstrated by the earlier three presentations. Some of the themes that fall under FPE would be fundamentally the politics around access and control of resources. Feminist political ecology has advanced from political ecology being a subfield and has looked into gender in wider terms, decentering gender and looking at it more in more intersectional terms, and looking at identities as much more multiple than one-dimensional. It also looks at colonial continuities, such as the presentation that Mai from Indonesia had presented earlier. It looks at elite and masculinist and patriarchal corporate capture in the appropriation of nature, such as Sarah and Kanawan have demonstrated. It looks at resource grabs, dispossession, mobility, displacement. It looks at environmental governance that also deepen exclusions as well as injustices. These are the themes, these are the usual themes covered by FPE. My co-author, Becky Elmhurst from the University of Brighton, thought that we might do a book that would sort of depart a little bit from these usual themes, but actually center more on knowledge, power, and practice on the part of those actually engaging in practices to transform environment and development. So we're actually producing a book, and our slant would be knowledge, power, and practice in the realms of environment and development. Feminist political ecology conventionally has found a lot of purchase from social activist realms and environmental justice realms. And we would like to ask ourselves in this book, what about those in the mainstream, especially in the niche of environment and development practice? Can we bridge these activist realms with more mainstream institutions? The second impetus was also environment and natural resource management organizations. We thought they deserve unpacking. Your NGOs, your global organizations, your SEIs, for instance. They deserve to be unpacked and to see how they are actually not homogeneous but heterogeneous epistemic communities. They do have practices, they're often sites of power negotiations, sites of power dynamics. They are also knowledge hubs, as epistemological hubs, where the politics of knowledge come into play and where established authority, epistemic authority is also firmly comes into play and firmly established, asking questions such as which knowledge counts and whose knowledge counts. Thirdly, we were also inspired by recent research publications on aid. David Moss, for instance, Rosalind Iben, and others, who have really looked into development professionals themselves, also from feminist perspective on the part of Rosalind Iben, unpacking the social life, for instance, of interventions. I think this efforts came in the 1990s from Wageningen University, for instance, who looked at actor-oriented approach, looking at development frontline workers and unpacking how they engage with what we call to be target beneficiaries. And secondly, it's also, as I said, looking at the flip side, looking at those who actually construct truth, or regimes of truth around these interventions. What serves as authoritative truths. So this would be our sort of inspiration with respect to coming out with this book. But we sort of identified a niche for ourselves, and that's environment and development, whereas the research literature has looked at development professionals in wider terms. We've narrowed it down, and we've looked at gender professionals in environment and development, and necessarily they would have to engage with science. So just to give you a bit, sort of a sneak peek of these gender professionals and experts in environment development, so you see different logos there. Many of our book's contributors actually come from these organizations. Some of these perhaps you are familiar with, the CGIAR family, FAO, the UN family as well. There's some NGOs are also there, ABWLD, Energia, SEI is also there. So we see a growing professionalization of gender, and we find that they are spread all over the world. What is known to be a cadre of experts spread globally, mainly tasked to mainstream gender. Those of you who are not familiar with gender mainstreaming, this impetus came from 1995 in the World Conference on Women in Beijing, where gender mainstreaming became mainstream in the sense that the whole mandate was to ensure that gender was integrated in development in a more mainstream manner rather than left at the wayside. They became increasingly visible, gender professionals in environment and development organizations, largely because of global normatives set by, as you know, the SDGs. You have, for instance, SDG number 5 on gender equality, the Millennium Development Goals earlier, the Paris Agreement, and much earlier on, 1992, where all these gender and environment sort of erupted and found some kind of explosion, Agenda 21 and the Beijing Platform of Action way back in 1995. So the normative environment was already in place. And the third part is also, we find there's been a lot of ambivalence with respect, for instance, to gender mainstreaming. Has it made any advancement? Has it really improved the lot of women, for that matter? These are hard questions we are now asking ourselves. And in the last decade or so, there's been a rethinking and a questioning of gender mainstreaming, in fact. With respect to those gender professionals in environment and development, we find that there's an increasing institutionalization and what we call a technocratization of feminist goals and strategies in mainstream organizations, some of them listed here, and which serve to therefore blunt the political goals of feminism, blaring social justice and transformative goals. So in this sense, we are worried that feminism is losing its political edge. See, the objectives of the book are largely self-reflexive. I think it's a moment for us gender professionals to actually look at our work and, shall we say, even come up with pathways forward. So we reflect on our experiences and our shifting and oftentimes troubled subjectivities. We're often thought to be advocates, not scientists. Or are we scientists that are advocates, who are advocates? So there's this kind of ambivalence, some kind of sense of trouble that most professionals feel in this technical field. We also have very uneasy engagements with other epistemic communities, notably the scientific and positivist communities. We, in our work, in this book, unpack the politics of knowledge in the manner by which gender is found to be acceptable in environmental discourse and practices. Again, the question is whose knowledge counts, which knowledge counts. But at the same time, we'd like to signpost promising pathways towards a more politicized feminist practices in environment and development. So some of the things that's been coming out from the book are the following, and this is really just very partial and still tentative. So, like for instance, a quote from one contributor said that her colleagues often ask her, "Please genderize my proposal to address donor requirements. Can you please sprinkle some gender dust on my program proposal?" So there are all these quotes, really, really great quotes that are coming out. Of course, the usual conventional way of ensuring there's gender parity in terms of numbers in participation, that is so pervasive. I thought we never see this again because of all the critique around this, but we still find it. There's a lot of suites of very technical tools for planning and evaluation. They're called gender markers. They have served to sort of simplify the complexity with which we know gender and power dynamics are. In some organizations, we find somebody saying, "I'm part of an organization that prioritizes crop productivity, so I ensure women are included to ensure technologies are also learned, skill sets are also learned by women." And then there's a cost-benefit analysis that is spreading around. It's been around for a long time, but I remember, for instance, FAO came out in 2011 in their landmark publication. And this sort of set into motion a lot of efforts to resort to cost-benefit analysis to make the case to include gender. In that FAO publication, and I quote, it said, "Giving women the same access as men to agricultural resources could increase production on women's farms in developing countries by 20 to 30%. This could raise total agricultural production in developing countries by 2.5 to 4%. So we find here subtext of instrumentalization of women's labor for the purposes of market and economic growth. And then there's also, again, growing more pervasively, the idea of gender equality as a business case, investing in gender parity, creates more efficient organizations, and hence this will lead to more profitable organizations. So gender indeed has become mainstream, but is it something that, is it in the form that we would like to see it? That's one of the questions the book is asking. And then there are, of course, expressions of resistance. We are not gender professionals. Gender professionals are very much tied to development. We are, first and foremost, feminists. So you find all these ambivalent views from our contributors. What are then the sort of tentative explanations that we put forward with regards to why gender increasingly is becoming technical. I borrow a term from Tanya Lee, who said rendering development technical. In this case, we render gender technical. Why is gender being rendered as technical? From the perspective of environment and development organizations, we find, of course, already mentioned earlier, that authority is vested in positivist thinking, and that's coming from the Enlightenment science. And what is this positivist kind of thinking? The value attributed to objective and value-free knowledge. That is why, in a sense, gender is being simplified and rendered as one-dimensional and taken away from its complexity. And that's where I go to bullet number 2, where gender is being made practical and simple to be able to manage and offer doable solutions that detach gender inequality from its complexity. And the same, I may say, is being done to nature and to the environment. We need to make nature intelligible so that we can control and manage it better, because it is considered to be unruly nature. And the last point is the convergence of development with neoliberal rationalities, supportive of, as the quotes earlier mentioned, investing in gender and the rise of managerialist approaches, this concern for simple solutions and practical methods that mark out gender work by counting women and creating a set of indicators. What has been the feminist critique and society, technology, and science studies? It's been around for some time, but I think we have to re-emphasize it even more. Knowledge is something situated. It is from a knower, or if you like, an expert or professional from somewhere. It is not from a knower from nowhere. We, the knowers are not disembodied or disembedded from the rest of social life. I will tell this to my modular colleagues, who are my friends. There is more. One other thing is we'd like to put forward is there's more than one way of knowing, and I think this is the theme of this workshop is that knowledge is actually plural, and therefore we must, in feminist studies, for instance, we look at embodiment and how our experiences through our bodies actually generate forms of knowledge. Science, that this is the contribution of STS, is socially created or even culturally created. It has its artifacts or cultural artifacts. In gender development, I would say all these tools, all this suite of markers would be our cultural artifacts. There are actors involved, there are stakes and interests involved, there are power dynamics involved. There are agreed upon practices and rituals. Science is also purposed for particular ends. And lastly, technical science is traditionally, conventionally, if you look at universities, I think even today, they bracket out the social. The social is usually only accepted in positivist terms, and I suppose that has been the lot of gender mainstreaming over time. So this is my last slide, and sort of want to see what's emerging, what sort of pathways for praxis, for transformative practice, as my co-author Becky Amber says, research and practice that empowers and promotes social and ecological transformation. And when we say praxis, we here refer to practice that is informed by theory and practice that also informs theory, so that kind of dialectical approach. We look at, for instance, praxis to be relational, meaning that there are people involved, whether it be stakeholders, practitioners, researchers, and they are interconnected in real-world situations. We share the responsibility to foster change. Perhaps a starting point is to identify what are our shared values, what are our shared objectives, and perhaps what they call shared ontologies. The other thing is, and that we're trying to attempt in this book, is the challenge for reflexivity in practice. Knowing our positionality, who we are vis-a-vis the institutions of power. What are our multiple identities, and making this transparent. Intersectionality, of course, is a consciousness that we have to push through. It's consciousness of multiple interlocking identities marked by power that either marginalize or privilege some groups. A conscious politics of scale, exempting gender from higher and transnational scales of inquiry and analysis. Usually, and I don't know for this workshop, for this meeting, whether gender is in discussions and conversations on transnational climate change, for instance. Usually, the conceptual center stage or the analytical center stage of gender is at the micro level. But as mentioned earlier, we should be conscious that scale as well is something political. Triangulation, this has come from the geographers actually, who actually challenge us that, you know, there was an era, maybe those of you here who are younger, perhaps 1990s and the early 2000s, and everything was integrated. Integrated natural resource management, integrated water resource management. I think that era now is being questioned and that kind of thinking is now being challenged. And why don't, instead of integration, why don't we instead triangulate? Why don't we have the different positivist and non-positivist methods, but at the same time be very upfront about the limits of specific methods and what they can actually achieve, rather than position them as overarching and authoritative. For instance, relying only on indicators only, rather than, let's say, narratives and looking at processes. Okay, and here, of course, identifying entry points for dialogue. Many of our contributors engage in that, identify possible points of entry, reversal perhaps, or even switches, whereby potential openings for struggle, deliberation, and contestation may occur to actually change environment and development practices. And finally, overall, we are calling for an alternative ethic of care. And I think we were blue in the face saying this all the time, disentangling care from its current market value and gendered obligation, or from women, and shifting to care justice, caring for each other, for non-human others, and of course, nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Babette. So our presentation's finished, and now it's time for Q&A. I think we have about 10 minutes before we have lunch. Yeah, because we started, and how about we spend like 15 minutes? No? You're not hungry? Okay. Okay. We have 15 minutes for Q&A or clarification, please. It's so exciting session. Okay. Mine is ready on Skype. If we have something, questions for her directly, yeah, she's ready to answer. Okay. Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay.
Hi. Hi, I really love this session. Thank you all of you. My name is Laila Mehta. I just wanted to find out more about pink crabs. If you could talk a little more about, I didn't get that, sorry. What's pink crabs? Pink crabs. Oh, okay. And also about how we can, this whole idea of the alternative pathways. How can we get that also into the mainstream discourse around environment and development, and not just so it's a sort of FP kind of thing. And again, it's great that we've raised all these things, but let's make sure some of these issues also get into the wider, I think, political ecology or environment and development discourse.
Maybe Sarah first and then Babette.
So thank you very much for your question. In fact, this concept kind of came out of my research departed from green grabs, right? So the appropriation of nature for environmental ends. Then I realized that it was not just for environmental ends that nature was being appropriated, but that nature was also being appropriated for migration aids. So with the idea that by appropriating nature and putting it to work in better ways, we can create the employment opportunities that are necessary to keep people in place. And this especially at the time of the migration crisis that we're seeing globally. So that a lot of these land grabs did not only have environmental justifications, but that a lot of the land grabs had migration justifications behind them. And most poignantly, this happens in Senegal rather than in Cambodia, because investors and the agenda in Europe is really to try to find ways to keep people in their place, right? So then from this, and coming more strongly and wanting to move more strongly into feminist studies, I was asking myself, well, does this kind of dynamic also happen with regards to gender equality? So are natural resources being appropriated for gender aids? In the sense, are we appropriating nature to create labor opportunities, to empower women, etc.? And a lot of these land grabs are linked to the aim of women empowerment. So how does that occur, and how are gender discourses being manipulated for further commodification of nature? But this is something that I'd like to explore. It's not that kind of spin-offs my work until now, but that I don't have a definitive answer yet. Thank you.
Respond to.
I don't have a straight answer, Lila. I think it's a dilemma that we've been facing for. I think it's a dilemma we've been facing for, I suppose, so many decades. How do we mainstream? And I think efforts to try to do it since 1995 have merited some rethinking. Indeed, because of questions of co-optation, technocratization, and all these so-called managerialist, techno-managerialist approaches to gender, losing the complexity and the political edge that feminism originally intended itself to be. I suppose one piece of breakthrough is that we are increasing. I used to think many years ago, I used to think that my co-author here, Becky and Elmers, when we cross a very crowded Hanoi street with all the motorcycles, that if one of us gets hit, that would be the end of gender environment. Now, we have gender professionals who are definitely multiplying, thanks to many things, shall we say the donor environment for that matter, shall we say global normatives. There is an effort, and I believe that gender equality is already by now a fairly established discourse, normative discourse. Now the job is really how do we ensure that that's really acted upon, that there are changes, palpable changes, transformative changes that actually take place, and we depart from an era of lip service and technical tools. That we go into we actually go and sort of get our hands dirty, pull up our sleeves, and look at the complexities of power and gender. One way, of course, is that, for instance, I don't have to think far, is conferences like this. We could have, for instance, spread ourselves across all the panels and actually discuss issues of gender and power or feminist political ecology. And engage with those other political ecology research. Other ways, of course, is the book that we're trying to do and reach out to gender professionals themselves to be able to actually reflect on their practice. So there are many things that we can still do, but I think we need greater numbers, we need greater commitment, I would say, and a mind shift.
I mean, we still have time, so we'll come few questions, please. Anyone would like to have a question? Please raise your hand. One and two. Okay, first.
Thank you all for your presentations. I have a question for Sarah on your presentation. You mentioned the concept of self-fulfilling risks, and I was just wondering if you can please elaborate the concept a bit more, and I'm also curious how that plays out particularly within the context of pink grabbing.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for your very, very good question, to which I will try to partially answer. So self-fulfilling risks, it comes from the concept of self-fulfilling prophecy, right, by Merton, which is to say that the definition, a false definition of a situation can actually lead to that situation itself by kind of creating the conditions. So this is a bit what I look at by looking at neo-Malthusian security frameworks and neoclassical adaptation frameworks that frame, by framing migration as a security threat and doing certain interventions such as closed borders, such as enclosures to try to keep people in place, etc., actually do end up making migration a security threat. And here I can't go into the full details of that, but in my dissertation I explore actually how some of these grabs that have been used on the star lists, especially in Senegal, to try to give them a likelihood to try and, these kind of terrorist hotspots, that they are framed as terrorist hotspots especially, how actually in places that were extremely Pacific to begin with, it is the marginalization through history of these people that actually leads to certain counterinsurgencies and to certain terrorist linkages. So there was never a terrorist problem to begin with, where you put interventions to try to solve it, that actually create, or that can spin off into the very problem that you were trying to avoid. So how do we need to redefine that? And that is just one example of a self-fulfilling risk that I see in my dissertation. I can't, unfortunately, how I've answered, I haven't had the opportunity yet to look into pig grabs. I hope that I will, and hopefully together we will. We are colleagues. And I hope that we will be able to look at that. So seeing how false definitions of what gender equality is, such as the ones that Babette has presented, how this technical, managerial understanding of gender, how do they lead to interventions that actually make the problem much worse than they were to begin with? And how important is it to change the very definition, right, of what gender equality is, to make sure that we don't lead to these self-fulfilling prophecies? But unfortunately, I don't have a definitive answer on pink grabs for now to come.
Okay, yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I think all the presentations were insightful and also resonated with some of my group I belong to in India. It resonated quite a bit. I just want to make a small comment about all just taking the discussion forward of what Benedict presented. Especially the last section of your presentation, which is more to do with the transformative element of this feminism and ecology. There is an increasing professionalization taking place not only in terms of gender, but I think many fields. I think rendering very up and political issues being rendered as technical, I think is happening. I think many spheres. And one of the reasons I look back, because I got into political movement in the 80s and 90s. I mean, that's the time when I got out of the university. So that time, women's issues or feminism or women's movement were more fought in the streets as mass movements. But today, I think maybe around 2000 onwards, there are sporadic movement. I'm not saying there's nothing, but it is more of a project which people do. It's more of what I usually call an NGOization of the entire political spectrum. Within that, I think feminist movement also has that, maybe because of funding and other type of things. So it is important to rediscover the mass movement character of feminist movement when we talk about praxis. Other praxis can be, or praxis can be also today mean, we do a 3-year project or a 4-year project, we do something, there are implemented gains of that, I'm not saying it's not. So probably rediscovering the political space as a mass movement is an important thing if you have to take this agenda forward.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, when I attend UN meetings, I always ask, where are the movements? Where are our feminist colleagues from the movements, even if the topic is on gender? I think they're so important. I think they push the frontiers, and I think engagement should continue with them. Thank you.
Maybe anyone to ask last question? Okay, I think otherwise we don't have to summarize, but feminist political economy is very important and still more important in the future because of a lot of female around the world, particularly in the Mekong, where I have been experiencing, they still suffer from the development. So we need more women to engage in the political decision-making process and support the civil society movements on gender. Yeah, I think that's the key. Okay, thank you very much for joining us. Okay, and thank you very much for the presentation from the panelists, including myself. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Will the presentation be circulated?
I don't know how.
Yeah, we'll put them online later.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Yeah.